a village by the sea. Fishing boats, cottages, and a gorgeous view. A perfect place to escape from a busy world. But look a bit closer and there's a different story.
I'm Ben Robinson, and as an archaeologist I want to explore the places where we live, to see how they've changed and hopefully dig up the odd surprise about their past. We often think of our coastal villages as remote outposts, places of relaxation and retreat, but they've been on the front line of history, from the arrival of Christianity through desperate battles with neighbours and nature, slave trading and the birth of modern tourism.
In the 1700s, the village of Sunderland Point in Lancashire was one of the busiest ports in the country. Trade with the New World transformed the way we lived and worked, creating great wealth which can still be seen in our towns and cities. But this success came with a huge cost to human life, and to this day remains one of the darkest periods in British history.
This is the village of Sunderland Point. It's all front and no back, just 30 or so houses arranged in 2 terraces, all looking out over the water. It's a landscape that changes with the weather and with the tides. How about that for a view?
Sunderland Point is on the northwest coast, where the River Lune meets the sea on the edge of Morecambe Bay. The city of Lancaster lies 5 miles upriver. Sunderland means separated land, and twice a day this peninsula is cut off by the tide. Here, nature dictates the pace and rhythm of life. Sunderland Point owes its existence to the sea, and some still make a living fishing. But what started as a community catching salmon on the River Lune would be transformed by overseas trade, propelling the tiny settlement onto the world stage.
This is Sunderland Hall. It's the grandest house on the peninsula, dating right back to the 1680s. It was the home of the Lawson family, who were Quakers and the most prominent family in the village. They joined forces with other merchants in and around Lancaster to form a consortium of ship owners and traders. In 1680, Sunderland Point was established as a legal quay, a place earmarked by the authorities for the loading and unloading of ships. Vessels would beach here before the goods were taken up to Lancaster by horse and cart, or upriver in smaller boats called lighters. Sensing an opportunity in 1715, Robert Lawson set about transforming this area of coast into a one-stop shop for all shipping merchants' needs. Now, there's no portrait of him existing, but look what he left behind. Using stone that we think came from Cockersands Abbey, he built warehouses, a smithy, and this alley or wynt. It was a rope walk, and it's here where the long ship's ropes were made. In developing Sunderland Point as a port, Robert Lawson overstretched himself. He was declared bankrupt in 1728.
On the back of Lawson's investment, the other Lancaster merchants continued to trade and became extremely rich from their profits.
It's hard to imagine this sleepiest of villages as a thriving port, but this path would have been heaving with sailors tumbling out of what was the Maxwell Arms. There's no pub here today, there's not even a shop, but if you look closely, the clues to the past are everywhere.
Alan Smith has lived here all his life.
You were very insistent that we met on this spot. Why is that?
This is the house that I was born and brought up in all those years ago.
And is that an appropriate motto for the house?
Very much so. Multum in parvo, Latin for much in little. And there had to be much in little due to the fact there were 7 of us in there. 7?
Yes.
Oh. Yeah.
The house looks like a bit of an afterthought to me, wedged between these bigger buildings.
There would have been a alleyway or a ginnel, but they decided to squeeze another property in, thankfully.
Looking at the houses, there's something almost thrown together about them. These don't look as though they started off as houses to me.
Indeed not. Number 14 was a hotel, and latterly it became a working farm. But the properties either side were warehouses.
Yes, that explains the austere fronts.
Indeed.
and those curious roof spans as well.
Yes.
You don't build a house like that. They do look like big storehouses.
That's right, there were storehouses.
I think that's a good motto for the whole of Sunderland Point myself. There is so much here.
Yes.
It's such a small place, but
Yes.
there's so much here.
Absolutely.
So much
absolutely
history.
brimming.
So here we are in the heart of the village, but we're on a beach, and there's a quay wall here.
The quay wall would have been built during the 1700s, not necessarily to berth the ships alongside. The ships used to come and berth at the bottom of the shore. They were flat-bottomed, so they would berth out level. This would be put in place so that they could build the properties on top of it, above sea level.
So it's acting as a sort of revetting wall and
Indeed.
a protection as much as anything else.
Indeed it is.
Just above the wall is Alan's current home, which was originally 3 fishermen's cottages and a blacksmith's shop.
So the front of the house has a 19th century makeover, but at the back I can see this is a much earlier property.
The outlines of the windows that you can see perfectly illustrate probably the size of the cottages. Behind your shoulder is a building outline that you can see,
Oh
a
yes,
gable
these
end.
coins here.
Yes,
this is
exactly.
the end of the building.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah. So how far back does this property go?
I would hazard a guess, because the blacksmith shop goes back to 1697, that the foundations possibly originate from the 1600s.
Yeah.
And here we are at the blacksmith shop. Yeah. Because of Sunderland Point being a port, it would be forging things for the sailing ships, for the repairs, and all other manner of things apart from the agricultural side as well.
A lot of ironwork on a ship, isn't there?
Very much so.
A lot of stuff to rust,
That's
a lot
right.
of stuff to repair.
Yes.
Every house tells a story, and up here on a high point in the centre of the peninsula is what's called the summer house. This wasn't built as a residence at all, but it's a place where wealthy merchants could come and sit and wait, literally, for their ships to come in. What a fabulous room. Excellent. There's windows on 3 sides, so you can look down the Lune towards Lancaster there, or out towards the Irish Sea in this one, or watch the ships coming in to the quayside here. And I can just imagine them sitting in here saying, oh, ship's appeared, is that one of yours, Roberts? No, that's William's, never mind, next time. And the wind direction was really important. That determined when ships could sail, when they could come back into the port. Up on the ceiling is a weather rose, a compass. And there was a weather vane on the roof and a pointer down here. This is a reconstruction, but that would have told them from the comfort of this room which direction the wind was in. And it said that there was a fantastically well-stocked wine cellar with the finest wines in the region just down here. So you can just picture the scene. They're all sitting here. It's quite convivial, but also perhaps quite tense. When are the ships coming in? So where were the ships going to and from? Well,
the roads were really bad at the time, so a lot of cargo was transported up and down the coast, and there was trade with the Baltic. But looking at this plantation-style balcony that was added to Sunderland Hall gives another clue. A lot of the trade was transatlantic, and the first ship to leave Sunderland Point for the West Indies was called the Lamb. It left here in 1687, bound for Jamaica. Ships had travelled to and from the West Indies, picking up commodities like tobacco, this is chewing tobacco, sugar, this is freshly cut cane and dried cane here, and these are sugar cutters. This was for cutting off the block or cone or loaf of refined sugar, little bits of sugar there. And it's said that the very first bale of cotton to be landed from the West Indies into this country was landed at Sunderland Point. The locals didn't quite know what to make of it, so it just sort of lay around unused. To me, it's extraordinary to think that Sunderland Point kick-started this industrial revolution in the north, the cotton towns, the dark satanic mills. Absolutely amazing. But back in the 1700s, the most important commodity to be landed here was mahogany, this beautiful dark wood that was taken upriver to Lancaster to be made into furniture that's prized to this day. While Sunderland Point was the port, the merchants were living in Lancaster in beautiful houses like this, and the wonderful genteel Georgian architecture attests to the wealth that was being accumulated at the time. This is the workshop and offices of Gillow & Co, who became one of the finest cabinet manufacturers in the world. And there are plenty of examples of their craftsmanship just across the street in the Judges' Lodgings. This fine, ancient, Georgianised townhouse was home to visiting judges right up into the 1970s as they presided over the assize courts. The lodgings are now a museum managed by Linda Jackson.
This beautiful ladies' workbox is a very, very fancy sewing box from 1808, made by Gillow's, and if you look closely you can see the Gillow's Lancaster stamp at the front there. And this is a kind of specimen piece. It's got 72 different samples of wood from all around the world in it.
Wow, it shows where the tentacles of trade are extending to. We've also got English oak here, Jamaica satin wood, East India satin wood, Botany Bay wood. It's coming from all over, isn't it?
Yes.
Ceylon wood. Is this mahogany?
Yes, this is Honduras mahogany and the bookshelves and the back and the base, and then Jamaican mahogany and the rest of it on the front, with holly inlay as well.
Do we know who commissioned it?
Yes, this was Mary Hutton Rawlinson who commissioned the piece, and she was the widow of a West Indian merchant, Thomas Hutton Rawlinson, who left £49,000 in his will, which is an absolutely huge amount of money. Very, very wealthy lady. And you can see she was a Quaker. She's dressed in the Quaker style, but she's also got very kind of fine silks and ribbons in her outfit as well.
These are effectively multi-millionaires in the day, aren't they? And this wood, so it's coming from Africa, West Indies, coming into this country, being made by Gillow & Co. Presumably, this is then going out all over the world.
Yes, so this particular piece, the Gillows will have imported the mahogany in probably themselves from the West Indies, but they regularly imported. A lot of their business was importing and exporting goods, so they imported sugar, rum, woods, fine woods, and they exported the manufactured goods, so all these beautiful pieces of furniture. But they also packed them. They were very savvy businessmen, and they packed them with goods manufactured in Britain that they could then sell in the West Indies or North America as well.
Oh, really? So they act as containers in their own right to go back out across the world.
Yeah. So they make lots of money on the on both journeys.
It's hard to believe today that all these exotic goods were being imported and exported through Sunderland Point. And in 1736, merchants began trading in a very different commodity, one that would bring even more wealth: slaves. Professor Robert Beckford is an expert in black religious history. Robert, when people think about the slave trade, they're usually thinking about places like Bristol and Liverpool, not places like this.
Oh, that's right. There are records that demonstrate at least 100 ships left Sunderland Point and made the trip to West Africa. So they were quite involved in the slave trade. And records suggest also that something in the region of 29,000 enslaved people were boarded on ships from Sunderland Point in this part of Lancaster. So they were quite deeply involved, but small fry compared to Bristol, Liverpool, London, and also Glasgow up in Scotland.
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? It's this industrialisation of something which had been going on for centuries. I mean, let's face it, in different forms across the world. But this is making it industrial. It's making it a big industry.
That's a good word to use. It is industrial slavery. You have a golden triangle of business taking place. Goods that were manufactured here in the north of England, taken to the west coast of Africa to be traded for enslaved people, and then the next leg of the journey going to the West Indies, known as the Middle Passage, 3 to 4 weeks of absolute hell on water for enslaved people. And then on their arrival, being exchanged again for the goods, the commodities that could get you very rich within England, the rum, the tobacco, the cotton, the sugar, transported to England and then refined, manufactured, sold on. So it was a triangular business, very lucrative, but incredibly dangerous.
I'm glad you mentioned that side of things and the commodities involved. I've got a very interesting book I want you to see in here. This is a package or packet book from the ship called the Hope, and it's the most extraordinary thing. We've been loaned it, and it just incredible here. And it's describing a voyage to the Cameroons. It's Captain Collins here. It's May 1792, and he's complaining about the health of everyone that he's dealing with. He's had to bury one of the white sailors, but here, having lost 20 slaves, and he's complaining that some of the slave traders have fallen ill, and he's saying here, having now 170 slaves on board. He's basically saying this isn't going to be a good trip. Everyone's ill, everyone's dying.
I mean, this wouldn't be unusual. It represents a everyday occurrence on the first leg of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, we know for sure that not only did Africans suffer from the unsanitary conditions aboard slave ships, but also the white sailors, and that's why he notes the fact that sailors are dying as well.
This book is all about the business transactions, the things that they're actually taking out there. There's also ammunition and guns going out as well.
Guns were very important because one of the ways in which you ensured that you could capture slaves was by arming one group of Africans against to fight another group and procure slaves that way through people captured in battle or just simply stolen. It's the beginning of what colonialists talk about in terms of divide and rule. You arm one group to suppress another group.
What surprises me is that a lot of people involved in this trade were Quakers. It just doesn't seem to square with their ideology.
You're completely right. It's a contradiction. At the heart of Quakerism was a belief that everybody had a bit of the divine within them. All life was sacred. So it's kind of ironic then to find people with such a distinctive doctrine trading in human flesh. And the Quakers were conflicted about this. Initially, there were Quakers who were involved in the slave trade, but it soon became evident that you couldn't be a Quaker and a slave trader or involved in the business in any way. But for some Quakers, the lure was just irresistible. There was just too much money to be made from slaving, and they continued despite the church telling them to stop.
For many people in Britain at the time, those plantations, that was the other side of the world. They weren't actually witnessing it at first hand.
They weren't witnessing it, but they were complicit within it, and they experienced it on a daily basis, whether they were having mahogany furniture in their homes, or drinking tea or coffee or sugar. They were involved in the trade. It was in the air that they breathed. And we shouldn't forget that the profits from the slave trade were the yeast that allowed the British economy to rise to a position of prominence in the 18th and 19th century. So they were all involved in it, either directly or indirectly.
And although the trading triangle meant that the majority of slaves were taken to the West Indies and America, a few landed here in England. There's a poignant reminder that an enslaved African boy actually came ashore here at Sunderland Point. Professor Alan Rice has researched the story.
We're here at what's now called Upstead's Cottage, which used to be the brew house. There's a very poignant and interesting story attached to this house. It was an African boy brought to these shores in around 1736, and he ended up being left here by his master. And whilst he was left here, he grew ill and died very shortly afterwards. The people, to give them credit, had a meeting and discussed what they should do, and a farmer who had a rabbit warren at the bottom of his field said the boy could be buried there. And they all decided that was the best thing to do. So they wrapped him in cloth and they had a procession along this very path here, up towards the burial place. So here's the gravesite itself.
It looks like a very well-tended grave, but this name, Sambo or Sambu, this is really problematic, isn't it? Could that have actually been his name?
Sambo's the kind of name which was given to an African boy once he became a servant, a kind of an everyday servant's name.
Like a sort of generic name.
A generic name. It then becomes an extremely racist name later on. And I think that takes us away from the real story of this boy, which is the fact that he is remembered here.
It strikes me, it's a very respectful burial. It's in a charming spot, you know. I know it's not consecrated ground, and they couldn't have known whether he was Christian or not. They assumed that he wasn't. But just the care that's been lavished on it, and the fact that it's been kept for all these years.
People sort of talk about the Windrush generation. There were Africans here many, many generations before, and we can find those stories at places like this.
Today, no ships land at Sunderland Point. Its demise as a port began in 1750. Business was booming, so a group of local merchants got together to form the Lancaster Port Commission, which in turn got permission from Parliament to build a brand new pier for the area. But where should it be built? The meandering River Lune has a high tidal range with strong currents. Throw stormy conditions into the mix and bringing in a ship could be really problematic. Scouting around for a sheltered location, the Port Commission chose Glasson, just across the water from the more exposed Sunderland Point. The Port Commission is still going today. Helen Loxham is its chief executive and oversees the busy operation.
Yeah, whereas Glasson Dock did win out over Sunderland Point, there wasn't any real competition as such. It was all the same group of merchants, but the pier that they got the permission to build under the first act is actually this one over here. But you can still see, which is the East Quay, and that's still very much in use today.
But that started as a pier, that's what they got permission for, so just a jetty going out into the water, effectively.
Exactly, yes, but the Act also gave them the permission to build any other harbour works that they felt were required for supporting the shipping into the port.
So that's a planning permission that says you can build this and then build anything else you like around it.
More or less, as long as it's to do with navigation, that's the crucial thing.
So there's a lot of investment here, and although it's developing over time, they're thinking about the next step the whole time. How can it become better and better and better?
Yes, absolutely, yes. I mean, they used to be able to hold up to 100 vessels in here.
100 vessels?
Yes. But of course, you've got to remember that the vessels, even the transatlantic vessels, were probably no bigger than the little tug over there.
So quite a facility, a lot of investment, a lot of money going into this place. It must have been really working for them.
Oh, it was, yes. It was the third biggest port on the west coast of England at the time.
Third biggest port?
Behind Liverpool and Bristol, yes.
Good grief.
Yes. But unfortunately, the ships got bigger. Which is a perennial problem here, because the river doesn't get any bigger.
The expansion of Glasson took all the trade away from Sunderland Point, and sailors making their way upriver started referring to it as Cape Famine as they passed the now deserted quay. An attempt to turn Sunderland Point into a tourist destination in the 19th century had short-lived success thanks to its remote location. But this makes an ideal habitat for wildlife. Villagers Alan and Ted are keen bird watchers. Oh, this is a great spot, this, isn't it?
It's quite wonderful.
You've got something really special here. The view must constantly change with the seasons, with the tides. Every day must be different.
Changes every hour.
Yeah.
So you've got beautiful views, you've got peace and quiet.
Yeah.
What are the other advantages of living here?
It's a fantastic place for wildlife. The number of birds we get, especially during the winter months, when they all return from their summer migration to the breeding grounds.
It's twice a day the rest of the world is cut off.
Oh yes, yes.
And they don't know anything about it.
That's right.
So they're cut off. You're not the ones cut off, they're cut off. But there must be disadvantages as well. When it's cold and the wind's blowing in and the sleet's coming down and you're cut off from the mainland.
In November, it can be very, very trying, and you've got to be quite resilient, I think, is the truth of it. But, you know, people hunker down, get their draft proofers out and...
Throw another log on.
Throw another log on.
Do visitors get caught out by the tide?
Yes, they do, and the problem is the road can be covered 2 hours before and 2 hours after high tide. They can get into serious life-threatening situations. And we've had a number of instances just this year of vehicles being flooded and people having to clamber out onto the roof and be rescued.
Would you live anywhere else?
No, I don't want to swap it for anywhere else. No, it's got everything that I want here.
Sunderland Point has gone full circle. From a remote fishing hamlet to a gateway to the world, back to a small community of just 60-odd people, all of whom are happy to be cut off from the outside world twice a day.
It's perhaps ironic that this village that grew up on the exploitation of the world's natural resources, in fact the exploitation of people, is now a haven for wildlife and a place that we can come to find peace.